Welcome back to another episode of the Blockrunner Podcast. I'm your host, William, always here with your co-host, Iman.
What's going on, dude?
On the sticks, we got TJ.
Hello.
And most importantly, joining us today, we got the CTO of Alex Lab, Chan. Welcome to the show, man.
Hey, thank you for having me here. I heard many good things about you guys, so I'm very excited to be here.
Excellent.
That's nice to know that the word is spreading about this channel. But yeah, we've definitely made a splash among the ordinals community, and we've been talking about this over the last few weeks. We've seen a lot of truly amazing things kind of manifest from ordinals, and with the BRC20s and bitmap ecosystem and such. All these things that we never really thought would make Bitcoin interesting again.
Yeah.
Because we spent the last 3 years kind of like navigating through Ethereum's waters and finding where all the cool innovations were happening, right? But now, this past year, 2023, was all about what are the innovations in Bitcoin?
Yeah.
Right. And then now we're kind of getting exhausted with like what we're seeing, to be honest, because it's mostly just
like tokens,
yeah,
fungible tokens, and
just tokens, meme coins, stuff like that. So we're like, okay, where's the DeFi?
Yeah.
Right. Where is that big, huge value unlock, and where's that going to occur? So there's some stuff kind of like in the mix with the TAP protocol and such, things like Ghosty Cash and whatever. So this is like ordinal native attempts at creating DeFi ecosystems. But Alex Labs and what's been happening on Stacks, this is like a multi-year thing you guys have been working on, kind of like trying to push this idea that DeFi can exist on Bitcoin, and it's truly valuable, and it makes a lot of sense to do that. So if you can't just kind of get us started, unpack like the origin of Alex Labs, and I think you guys were founded it like in the beginning of 2022, if I'm not mistaken, and explain your relationship with Stacks as well, and how all this came to be.
Yeah, sure. So we started almost 3 years ago. So 2021, I think it was May, something like that. So we have myself, I'm the CTO, and we have a Chante based in New York, and we have Rachel also based in Hong Kong. So three of us were thinking about what we want to do. All of us come from traditional finance in investment banking, and on the quantitative and derivative, generally all thing about finance. And then when around that time, the Uniswap V3, the white paper came out, and then that's when we felt that the technology on the blockchain has gotten mature enough for people like us to perhaps hopefully add the value. So that's when we started looking into this and started. Now, we actually spoke to, back then we knew very, very little, to be honest, about many things about the crypto. Still, we don't, but we looked around a few options, but the Bitcoin itself was pretty close to us, partly because of the background that we have. It's something that as a first timer, the crypto people experience, and institutional investors, there's always this tendency to focus on Bitcoin. So we wanted to do something on Bitcoin. It was sort of hard to find what, because back then Bitcoin DeFi sort of didn't exist. Still, it's very new. But we felt that if we can build something on Bitcoin versus, for example, EVM Ethereum, then from our perspective, it could be a lot more meaningful. And then what we already saw back then was the people that you speak to on the Bitcoin side are quite different from the typical EVM users. So we looked around and we wanted to do something on the Bitcoin. And then we came across Stacks folks who happened to be actually quite close neighbor of Chente. So what we felt was, okay, if we use Stacks as our smart contract layer and build on Bitcoin, and we know the people there very well, and therefore we can get a lot of support and really build together. And that's how we started. That was 2-3 years ago. Of course, we didn't think it would be sort of, to be honest, this hard. There have been a lot of ups and downs, but it has been sort of very interesting and a meaningful journey so far. But the changes we have experienced over the last few months have been actually very heartening, and hope we can continue building what we set out to build into this year, 2024, and beyond as well.
Yeah, that's such a big deal. So like Iman was saying, we've spent a lot of time building on the Ethereum network, and as soon as ordinals happened and early 2023, we started looking around. There's a lot of activity happening on Bitcoin, and I was always like, I was always attracted to the concept of Bitcoin, right? Its entire like proposition, right? It solved a computer science problem, but I'm probably a bigger nerd than Iman, and he wasn't as interested into Bitcoin as I was. Not until ordinals happened. And so once we started like searching into like, well, you know, all this like activity happening on Bitcoin, we discovered Alex, and we knew that DeFi was going to be like a big proponent to Bitcoin. So I'm curious as to why you guys decided to like focus on like Bitcoin rather than any other chain.
The Bitcoin is quite interesting in that now we started partly because there wasn't anybody doing it, and to be honest, we have been pivoting quite a bit ourselves to make sure we have the right product fit. I think building on Bitcoin is interesting because from the project builder's perspective, you have an opportunity where a few factors play into this. The first one is you have a blockchain that is essentially the biggest in the world that everyone recognizes to be the most decentralized and secure, and that provides a very solid foundation to build anything on. Now, the second one is partly because of its uniqueness and that it doesn't support smart contract. There has been slower adoption among the builders to use the Bitcoin as a blockchain. Yet, as you have seen, there are many the toolings in the economy that has been built on the Ethereum side. So there could be a lot of learning that one can take by looking at what has been done on the EVM, and then bring those many good ideas over to the Bitcoin. Now that means from the project builder's perspective, there are many what's the best way of putting it? If you like bang for the bucks, for all the low hanging fruits, there are many things you can do that can get you a lot better return for what you do versus, for example, getting into a much heavier competition in the Ethereum. The third one is now that what I said in the second one, and that's actually what a lot of people say when we speak to people about the building of Bitcoin, DeFi in particular. Why don't you guys just take whatever that was built on the EVM or Ethereum and then just fork them and then replicate? Now, one of the reasons why we chose Bitcoin, I explained, was because of the institutional interest and interest by the first timers, holding Bitcoin. Anyone who wants to do a crypto tend to hold the Bitcoin to start with. Now, if you then think about that versus the typical EVM users, what you call Web3 degen, the demographics that we are talking about of what you call Bitcoin holders is actually very, very different from the demographics that we talk about when it comes to the EVM or Web3 degen. Typically, we talk about 700 billion, 800 billion in the Bitcoin market cap, and always compare that to the Ethereum market cap. And then, if DeFi were this and that in the Bitcoin, how much of that, economy may be. But what people sort of miss often is what the people behind that market cap, who are they? Now, they tend to be a first timer, and the people holding Bitcoin in the CeFi, and definitely most of them in our analysis indicate are not Web3 degen. So that means is the UX and overall delivery of the product and economy that you build, that you want to deliver to your the target audience is also different, which provides project builders an interesting opportunity because they really can give you an edge over the existing players. Because if you understand the difference in your target audience and build the right user experience, you actually have an opportunity to build a far bigger economy on Bitcoin than one is possible on the EVM. So it's not without challenges. We can talk about Bitcoin L1 and then L2s, the difference between that versus EVM and so on. There are many sort of things in common and differences, but that is, I think, I said challenges, but also provides immense opportunities that I don't think any project developers or builders should ignore.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, Chan. And looking through Alex Lab website, there's a lot of the primitives in DeFi that you guys already cover. Swapping, you do
yield farming,
you have stable coin,
liquidity pool,
liquidity pool.
DEX, Launchpad. Yeah, list goes on and on and on.
So can you give us a rundown as to like, how what's the elevator pitch to Alex Lab for someone?
We are a one-stop DeFi platform for all the Bitcoin users. And you mentioned we have many things that has been sort of both blessing and then curse in certain respect, from our perspective, because people sort of were asking, why are we guys doing all this? If you think about in the EVM, the people often talk about the composability.
Yeah.
Now, if you then think about, again, going back to, but I think on the Bitcoin world, that one-stop platform that provides the seamless DeFi experience that is vertically integrated is very important, because your target audience is different. What they look for with our target audience is the convenience and, if you like, Web2 experience when it comes to DeFi. So in order to achieve that, you need to have a vertically integrated system with all the components across the Launchpad, AMM, and the bridges and so on tightly integrated. And Alex, as of today, is the only platform on Bitcoin that provides that. And you can see, for example, the way we integrate bridge with AMM. So, as of today, has been the case for the last 2 months, for example. Bitcoin users can spend their Bitcoin to buy, a number of USDT and so on, not through 2 steps of bridging over and then buy, but combining those 2 transactions into one. They recently launched the Launchpad that has just completed, and we're looking to distribute the reward as we speak. Allows Bitcoin users to participate using native Bitcoin into that without, again, having to go through the multiple hops. And those compression of multiple hops into a single seamless user experience is what we want to deliver to our target audience.
So is Alex Lab completely built on top of the Stacks ecosystem?
Correct. So we started as a Stacks DeFi. That was 3 years ago, and then subsequently we did become, we are still the biggest DeFi on Stacks, and Stacks continues to be our smart contract layer of choice. And I think that it probably is going to continue for the foreseeable future, in particular with the Nakamoto release, or what we call faster block or Stacks 3.0 that we expect to be released in the next few months. Now, from our architecture perspective, when it comes to the integration between the Bitcoin and the Bitcoin L2s, including the Stacks, the architecture allows L2s to be pluggable and allows us to integrate with other L2s that are emerging. So we are speaking to a number of Bitcoin L2s with a view to integrating them into our platforms. That way, essentially, we become the integration and the protocol layer integrating Bitcoin L1 and a number of Bitcoin L2. Again, with the aim that from the user perspective, the choice of L2 shouldn't matter. They should be able to go, jump between multiple L2s, depending on their use case. Now, having said it, so that is ultimate goal. But so far, all our infrastructure still heavily relies on Stacks, and I think that is going to continue. Although it may change over the course of this year and next as other L2s come online and then become mature.
I wanna dig a little bit deeper into stacks. I'm curious, like from your perspective, like what exactly is the interaction between Stacks network and the Bitcoin blockchain? Like what is the connection between those two chains, like technically?
I think the what is the connection between the two? I think from the user perspective, and from the relationship between the L1 and L2, if you think about, and then a lot of people sort of talk about, okay, why can you not just use the Ethereum mainnet for the smart contract capabilities and then bring it over? I think the biggest the difference that Stacks has that other cross-chain, if you like, L2s don't have. I think that defines really the relationship between the Bitcoin and the Stacks is that when the Bitcoin network forks or reorgs, then Stacks also reorgs. So there is a strong dependency in that whatever happens, Bitcoin also affects Stacks. And that actually creates tight the link between the Bitcoin and the Stacks, and that is quite important. It's an L2, and that's what I tell all the L2 builders, that if you don't have that sort of tight linkage between, for example, on the Ethereum mainnet even, there's a similar sort of security relationship that you have between the Ethereum mainnet and Arbitrum and Optimism, all the L2s. If you don't have that property, then for example, transferring the tokens between L1 and L2 is no different from transferring tokens between two different chains. I.e., you always have to wait for the finality. So, for example, 5 to 10 Bitcoin blocks. Now, that is going to impede building a great user experience just because you have to wait that long just for the token to transfer and then safely to be used, which doesn't exist on Stacks. And I think that is the unique position that Stacks has among everything else. Yeah.
That's interesting. So that means that anything that happens on Bitcoin, like you're saying, a reorg, that really affects the Stacks chain. So would you say that the Stacks chain mimics the activity of Bitcoin, but it has like this programmability layer on top of it?
That is correct. That is correct. I think that is very important, and you need to think about the purpose of the programmability that Stacks provides. And of course, I mean, on its own, it can do many things. But one of the most important things that we look at is how do you combine that programmability in a way that it supports the Bitcoin users and the value of the Bitcoin. What that means is the programmability should be able to be used in conjunction with the native Bitcoin, and that's where the ability or the tight integration is very important, because as of today, for example, if our user uses Bitcoin Bridge, the moment Bitcoin is deposited into our multisig, then that automatically triggers the smart contract interaction on back of it, rather than having to wait for the finality of 5 to 10 Bitcoin blocks, which we're talking about 1 hour and more.
Sure. Did you know that we're more than just a YouTube channel? We also built Mscribe, the first inscription platform built from the ground up for the metaverse on Bitcoin. Connect your bitmap ordinals and use our tools to bring your community into the virtual realm. Support us by joining the movement at mscribe.io. Like, comment, and subscribe for the latest alpha. Back to the video.
So how does the, I guess the upcoming Nakamoto release kind of impact this synchronicity between these two layers? Like, because you said that the block time is going to
go down to 5 seconds,
compress down to the 5 seconds as opposed to roughly 10 minutes. So is this kind of like a third layer that is emerging on top of Stacks that eventually gets rolled up into Stacks that eventually finds finality to Bitcoin, or is this something completely I'm not understanding at all?
The Nakamoto release is really a hard fork of a blockchain, L2 or Stacks, that is. So it's not going to be additional layer. Additional layer is definitely it's not an additional layer, because additional layer will create more friction. On the other, Nakamoto release will vastly improve the user experience people will have. And in the current design that we have in our OI infrastructure, we always have to be mindful when we build our user experience. of the delays user may experience in missing a stacks block. Stacks currently block because they are mined for each Bitcoin block. It can never be faster than the Bitcoin block. So if the Bitcoin block produces every 5 to 10 minutes, for example, then the stacks is going to be every 10 to 30 minutes, for example. So that is a significant barrier to building a great user experience. With a Nakamoto release, with a 5 seconds block, that problem goes away entirely. In that the speed, the programmability that we talked about, the smart contract experience that users will have on Bitcoin will be as native as, just from the sort of quote unquote, from the feeling perspective, than a Bitcoin experience as well, because Bitcoin network will continue to be constrained by the confirmation time of 5 to 10 minutes. And whatever happens on the stacks is going to add a few seconds only. So from the user perspective, they will not notice any difference whether they do on Bitcoin or whether they do on stacks. But now, what that allows us, sorry, my two dogs are barking behind me, is that we are then able to truly use a stacks as a smart contract layer by immediately moving, for example, Bitcoin over to stacks and then do something that user wants. And then once that's done, and then move the Bitcoin back to users in the manner that the people would normally expect in a native Bitcoin experience. And I think that is a very, very powerful, and commercially as well as from the user experience, very important.
So does that mean that when you're talking about 5-second blocks, does that mean you have like a visual, like you have like a giant Bitcoin block, and then on top of that you have the Nakamoto, stacks? And you have multiple 5-second blocks, basically with the same underlying data within Bitcoin. Is that the correct visual?
Correct. So I mean, this is a poor sort of analogy, but I mean, perhaps a rough comparison that we can draw is for example, Polygon POS, and the way Polygon POS works with Ethereum mainnet is through their own consensus. It produces many blocks themselves, and those if you like, a block of blocks get periodically settled into the Ethereum mainnet, right? So you can think of it as similarly for the new stacks with the Bitcoin. So Bitcoin will produce multiple blocks every 5 seconds, and a bundle of those blocks will then settle into the Bitcoin in the same manner that happens today. Does it make sense?
Yeah, that's interesting. So so now as a developer using or building on stacks, you're able to provide a better user experience while still maintaining the underlying Bitcoin asset is just on stacks, essentially.
Correct. I mean, I think the ultimate aim is you want to use L2 for the computation only, while you want to keep the asset on the L1 as much as you can. As of today, as much as that is our aim, because of the slower confirmation time on stacks, that is not practically really possible from the user experience perspective, although technically it is still possible. But it doesn't make sense. With the 5 seconds per block, combined with that the tight integration between the Bitcoin and stacks, what will happen is Bitcoin will be sent to stacks only for the processing or the computation. And then they can send back to the Bitcoin to the users, all within an acceptable sort of user time frame.
Yeah. Okay, that's starting to be a little bit more clear.
So, are the mechanisms of how do you port over, I guess, the value of your Bitcoin from layer 1 to stacks? Is it going to mimic or mirror like what the users experienced with Polygon? Meaning, like, there's a bridging process. Maybe it took a few hours to get your assets from layer 1 to Polygon, and then it took several days in order if you want to do a withdrawal. Is that going to be very similar to that?
No. I mean, that's why I said it may not be a good sort of in a comparison. But as I mentioned, if you use our Bitcoin bridge, the moment you send the Bitcoin and then it hits our multisig, then the smart contract action gets triggered immediately. So generally speaking, even today, we're talking about so users the Bitcoin gets confirmed, and then the action is triggered. So generally, we're talking about less than half an hour to 1 hour before the action is complete. So that is already far better than the cross chain the activity that you mentioned. For example, if you want to reach over a Bitcoin from the Bitcoin network to EVM, general expectation is going to take at least 2 hours, 3-4 hours, and so on, right? Now, when I talk about 30 minutes to 1 hour, that is with a slower confirmation time of the stacks. Now, when the Nakamoto release is out, then, as I mentioned, what user expect should be from the time frame perspective is essentially the same as what they would do natively on Bitcoin, i.e., 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay. Now, is there any security enhancements? Because we saw last, I guess, DeFi renaissance, layer 1 of Ethereum expanding into layer 2s, and same thing happening on other ecosystems. Like the porting of assets in between layers was a huge attack vector for exploits, and especially in the smart contracts and stuff like that. Is that something
more inherently secure in this manner?
Yeah.
So that is a big sort of area of improvement that people need to do. Now, the breach attacks and the smart contract exploit and so on, is sort of happened, quite a bit over the history for many reasons, and I think those reasons why they happen can again be explained by many things. Now, with the Bitcoin, the thing is, and the reason why I mentioned that assets should stay as on the Bitcoin L1 as much as possible, is partly because, or mainly because, Bitcoin is, as I mentioned earlier, the most decentralized and secure blockchain. So you want to keep asset on a secure layer, more secure layer, the better, right? So from that perspective, you don't want to move them to L2 unless it's necessary. Any L2 is not going to be as secure as L1, that's for sure. But there are many factors to consider here, not just the blockchain itself, because, for example, one of the limitations that we have, and one of the reasons recently why we spun off our bridge project as a separate project called Xlink, was, if you think about the Bitcoin, and I mentioned a few times already, we use multisig as a vault. Now, again, that is the technology used by all the custodians and so on. So essentially, you run a wallet with multiple private keys for security reasons. That is far better than single private key hot wallet. But the fact is that there's always this still remains the private key issues and the power that you give to the private key owners. So that is something that users need to be mindful that through the spin-off of Xlink and the decentralization of the governance as well as the ownership of the multisig, we hope to address. Now, the other thing also need to think about is we've spent a lot of time, we as an Alex, on what you call Bitcoin Oracle. Now, when you talk about the asset on the Bitcoin, we're not just talking about Bitcoin itself, but you guys also mentioned about tokens this and tokens that, BRC20, for example, and we have runes and we have many token standards and meta protocol standards nowadays that facilitate issuance of asset on Bitcoin, and I think that is absolutely necessary if you want to build the economy. But we also know that all these meta protocols do rely on the off-chain indexes, for example, which introduces additional security concerns because the data and the validation stays off-chain and very centralized. So how do you address those? That's why we are building Bitcoin Oracle to build essential consensus layer on Bitcoin to complement what is lacking with the Bitcoin, i.e., fundamentally the smart contract the capability. So there are multiple approaches that one need to take to make the Bitcoin environment, DeFi environment, secure. Having said that, it will never be as secure as Bitcoin itself. That is for sure. And to the extent that one can do, for example, PSBT, that on the Bitcoin, that will continue to be the more secure way than, for example, moving the tokens to the L2 and then bring it back. The question that we have is not about making the Bitcoin experience more secure, but making the right trade-off. If this is what you want to do, if you want to do more than keeping the Bitcoin in your cold wallet, then what is the most optimized process or the process that will maximize the value of what you're doing while minimizing the security concern that you have? So from that perspective, having a Bitcoin Oracle to secure all the meta protocols is of paramount importance. Securing multisig through the decentralized governance, like I mentioned, is very, very important. And then ensuring the integration of L1 and L2 is tight and timely, so that one can experience L2 computation without having to leave your money on L2 far too long than you'd want. So I think those combinations will give users the right trade-off. But again, it's not going to make Bitcoin necessarily more secure.
Sure.
That's not what you're trying to address here. Yeah.
So now that we're talking a little bit about ordinals and like these fungible tokens, were you surprised with what happened over 2023 with ordinals?
I think with the ordinals and in general sort of use of if you like witness data to do something, it's something that people talked about for quite some time, but the arrival of ordinal was to a certain extent. Now, let me put this: I think the arrival of ordinal was somewhat expected. How it took off from there. And even more surprising to me was actually a BRC20 token standard, being able to create a fungible token standard out of non-fungible, which I think, despite its many shortcomings, is very almost revolutionary. So the idea itself was somewhat, I think, expected, but how it took and developed over the course of last year, I think took many people by surprise, especially the ferocity of its development.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, because there was,
and you guys said yourself, you guys are exhausted now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that is the prevalent feeling, because it definitely feels like a separation occurring, not just within your ecosystem, like even on Ethereum, where Ethereum started off as this like ultimate showcase of a blockchain with programmability kind of caked into its design, and we got to see what manifested from that over the last several years. And then all of a sudden, like the inscription kind of pandemic that has kind of permeated from Bitcoin is now spreading outwards to Ethereum, and now we've kind of like, it feels, from some people's perspective, like we've taken a step backwards, at least when it comes to like functionality and robustness of the ecosystem, like what you can actually do with these assets.
Yeah.
Now we kind of have to like reinvent the wheel and come up with new technical processes to kind of like inject function to all of this, right?
Did you know that we're more than just a YouTube channel?
We also built MetaZone, the first app store for the metaverse.
Buy, sell, and explore a new class of digital assets like our flagship game, Rovi.ai.
Support us by collecting your digital assets through MetaZone at metazone.io.
Like, comment, and subscribe to stay updated.
Back to the video.
Yeah, so from your perspective, since you're the CTO and you're looking at the technical stack of what's required to run indexing and what's required to do inscriptions within Bitcoin, does it make sense as like from a developer's perspective that are we really taking a step back here, or is there merit in actually building an infrastructure here to support BRC20s and like everything that's happening on top of like this inscription witness data layer?
I mean, I think it's an interesting question, and the one that I would actually strongly disagree. I don't necessarily think this is a step backwards, and obviously, and because that somehow implies that Bitcoin as a network is somewhat inferior to what they call virtual machine in a blockchain,
right.
which I absolutely disagree with. And I think the Bitcoin's beauty is the way it is structured. And I think if you think about from the perspective of the modular design, if you like, which I think is far has a far better network effect than a monolithic design in general. And I think Bitcoin as a core engine of a secure and decentralized settlement layer, and then building on top, is actually could potentially be far stronger than anything else. For example, Ethereum mainnet even. But that's besides the point. But so that's the first point I want to make. It's definitely not going backward. It's just a different world, if you like, in different paradigm. The second, so I mean, again, I just want to emphasize this: it's not right or wrong. It's just different. That's it. The second one is from the project perspective, and myself included. I think that what you mentioned also misses point in that when we look at an opportunity, we're not necessarily focusing on technology itself, but what is important is the business, and what that means is your users. And as a technologist and as a CTO, you have the responsibility to bring your business to the target audience and your users. You cannot say, oh, I have this spare technology, which is questionable on this in a particular place, and I want my users to come to me because that's the right thing for my users to do. And I think that is, to be honest, very wrong way of thinking about it. And the cliche is your customers are always right. And if you want to succeed, then you need to bring your products to your users. So it's not really down to, and some people talk about, okay, for example, Stacks has clarity and, which is different from Solidity. And why doesn't Stack support, the Solidity and so on. The choice of technology and choice of programming language and so on from a developer isn't really a question. Now, lack of a support system does hinder the speed at which you can develop, for sure. But it is the most important thing is the presence of your users and the market that you can tap into. And if you again think about that perspective, it goes back to the Bitcoin market cap of 700 to 800 billion. So it doesn't matter where, it really doesn't matter where the technology is different or so on. If you want to tap into that market, you have to build on Bitcoin.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not a technology issue, really.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And we've interviewed a few people on the podcast over this last year, and they've had a history just like us with building on Ethereum, but they've also built on other chains like Solana and Bitcoin, Satoshi Vision, BSV. And their position was you have a lot better experience on these chains building, right? Because there is like support, right? However, there's not as many, the audience wasn't there necessarily on these particular chains. Maybe Solana is different, but BSV, there wasn't that big of an audience. So many of them kind of pivoted to Bitcoin, especially now with ordinals, and which illustrates your point is that you need to build your business to your audience where your audience is, and not just build some sort of superior technology and hope that they come to you, because it's shown that they don't, right? And so I do like your take on this whole ecosystem, because even though it may seem primitive at first, there is traction here. There is a ton of volume, and it's on the most secure chain that exists. And so it makes sense to kind of it makes sense to discover what the problems are in terms of user experience, and and solve those problems and create the business where the people are. So I really like that explanation. So we're gonna clip that, Chan, and we're going to shotgun that out to Twitter because they need to see this.
A call to developers, I guess, across all chains and ecosystems, like why you're all dropping the ball so hard. I guess
exactly
right.
Yeah, and what's crazy, Chan, is that a lot of people don't even know what's happening with Bitcoin.
I think right now we're starting to notice people are starting to just become aware. Specifically, like the influencer cartel of the cryptocurrency industry, right? Like the big influencers that kind of create these narratives and get people's attention. They're just now starting to, I guess, come around to the idea that there is value to be derived from Bitcoin, and like, this is where the attention should lie, right? And that's definitely what led us to, I think, that's what is pulling us in your direction, right? Because there are developers such as yourself, such as the team behind Stacks, who have been kind of executing in this environment in the absence of everything we were just describing, right? Kind of like you guys have come up with that thesis ahead of time, before the market kind of like confirmed, like, this is
the place to build, this place to be.
Right. So theoretically, you guys should be positioned better than anybody. Because you have such a huge lead and advantage over the rest. But yeah, you spoke about something that's very interesting to us. It's like this indexer, I guess, dilemma. I don't even know if you call it a dilemma, but I guess it's this new paradigm where, there's so much reliance on off-chain indexing. We have our own new, I guess, meta protocol standard that we've put out called non-arbitrary tokens, which right now is supported by the TAP protocol. And their whole initiative, their whole ethos behind what it is Track is building is an indexing solution to this critical problem. We cannot just rely on Unisat to be like the main indexer for these fungible tokens. And that goes across the board, right? So what is the solution to this? If we're creating such a convoluted space where we rely on, like, these indexers now become like the new attack vector, right? Potentially, because in a lot of cases they are centralized, right? So what is the solution? I know you guys are deeply involved in this. And there are other entities, I think, collaborating with you guys to kind of solve this, right? And Domo himself. Could you kind of like break that down, how the origins of that came together, the Bitcoin Oracle space, and how you see it manifesting from here?
Yeah, sure. So I think that is actually, and I spoke at multiple places as well. I think the most critical piece that we need with the Meta protocol is addressing the question of how do we build the consensus among all the centralized entities that help build those economies. Now, the problem is now, one can say, okay, well, we have CFIs, which are centralized entities, and, that's okay. And a lot of people say, well, if the CFI works, and why don't centralized indexes, not work? Now, the problem there is, the key difference there is the centralized exchange is, everyone knows it is, you're dealing with a corporate entity or an entity that is one, and everyone knows your money isn't really sort of real money, but is a ledger written in their book and so on. So there's general understanding, whereas anyone who trade on the Bitcoin don't expect the same thing. So it's actually quite dangerous to take that CFI assumption and apply to the DeFi world when it comes to centralization risk. Now, then the question is, how do we mitigate the centralization risk? And I think to a certain extent, again, it goes back to what I mentioned earlier, that we can do many things, but we cannot make it as strong as Bitcoin. That's for sure. So it's about trade-off. And the important thing is, when we talk about the consensus, then what we mean by that, and how strong should they be? Now, at the minimum, I think what we need to do is when you say consensus and meta protocols, we need to really thinking about two things. One is the computation they do, and it's not just specific to the meta protocols, but actually to L2s and everything that builds on the Bitcoin. And it's necessary, again, because Bitcoin doesn't support smart contract. But it needs to answer two questions. One is, does the computation happen off-chain, done correctly? That's number one. The second one is the process data with the off-chain computation. Is it stored safely? So is the correctness of the data and the safety of that process the data, both of which require the consensus. Now, on the Ethereum mainnet, and then that's what perhaps not many people realize, all the L2s, once they have done the computation off-chain, then they are then verified on the Ethereum mainnet, the smart contract, which is not possible. So that's where something like Bitcoin Oracle is necessary to really act as a go-between the Bitcoin mainnet or Bitcoin L1 and the Meta protocols, the indexes. So what Bitcoin Oracle does is the first point about the ensuring the correctness of the data. The way we ensure the correctness of the data and is, as the name Oracle implies, it works with a number of off-chain indexes, and it runs the consensus through running essentially M over N threshold. So currently we have 3 index providers that we work with. They are the Uniset, Hero, and the Best in Slot. And if 2 out of 3 indexes confirm that the particular BRC20 event is valid, then the event is deemed valid. Now, that doesn't definitively tell you that it is correct, that's for sure, in the sense that you have with a smart contract. But if you think about the security enhancement you gain by going from a single party reliance to multi-party, that is already a vast improvement over what one may have. So that's number one. The second one is, so once the BRC20 event, for example, is deemed correct, then that determining that is done through a smart contract, and that is on stacks. The data is saved on-chain. Now, currently, the off-chain indexes save their process data on, for example, Google Cloud and outsourced database host and so on. Hopefully, not in their hard drive, which can be easily tampered and manipulated and attacked. By saving those process data on-chain and into the Bitcoin, you have number one, correct data that is run through the consensus of multiple indexes, and number two, the data that is immutable and the censorship resistant. So I think that that then allows you to build a very, very solid foundation to build economy. Now, the reason why such a security is far more important for the meta protocols like the BRC20 versus, for example, the ordinals or NFT even. And the reason why the consensus among the indexes is important is, and that's often the discussion that we have. I don't know whether you guys are aware, but the old Jubilee upgrade, I think has happened or is happening very soon or yesterday, today. And the BRC20 community decided to freeze their version of ORD to 0.9 some time ago for the kind of discrepancies that we talked about. And in the run-up to the Jubilee upgrade, there were active debate among the indexers whether we should upgrade or not. Now, the reason why it is a lot more important for the BRC20 community than the ordinals community per se is because for the BRC20 community, for the fungible token, the individual uniqueness, which is represented by ordinal, isn't as important as is sequence, i.e. the history. So anything that changes the history of how those uniqueness changed matters far greatly, because you're talking about essentially changing how much money you have, because how much money you have is the cumulative history of how you spend your money, which is different from the ordinal itself. So that's why such a security is very important. Now, another benefit of having a Bitcoin Oracle, for example, is in the case of such active debates and potential divergence among indexes, And you may recall that actually we had a similar incident, I think a month or 2 months ago, with the OD balance held at the Binance hot wallet, with a one indexer, reporting what $800 million and another indexer reporting $300 million. So difference of only what $500 million.
It's no big deal.
Yeah.
By running the consensus. So I mean, the thing is, if you're a user who relies on the indexer that reports $300 million, depending on how you calculate, you may have lost up to 500 million. You know,
Yeah.
Imagine that heartache of that. Yeah.
Now, exactly. Now, Bitcoin Oracle, through running the consensus, is precisely aimed to address a problem like this. Any divergence among the indexes, any outlier will be filtered out, and the data you get is always representing the vast majority of what the community says. And I think that is very important, and it helps secure the overall economy that we're building.
So Chan, how do you scale something like this? Because we're talking about BRC20, the most important meta protocol for sure. But what if I want to create my own meta protocol and I need to leverage this security consensus? How would I tell you what my meta protocol is about? And like, is there some sort of technical way of doing so?
So yeah, so we published our product roadmap and also released our alpha version. There are a few things that we are doing here. The most important thing is, from the design perspective, Bitcoin Oracle is not specific to BRC20. It is applicable to all the meta protocols. In fact, to any the off-chain activity that brings the data back to, based on the Bitcoin data, that brings the data back to Bitcoin. So that actually includes the L2 as well. So we are speaking to, actually we spoke to Benny and his team about potentially integrating their protocol into Bitcoin Oracle, which is an ongoing discussion still. And we are speaking to a few other meta protocols that are emerging for the same thing. Where there's an off-chain indexer, I think there's a role to play for the Bitcoin Oracle as well. Now we are also speaking to other L2s. I talked about sort of a lot of L2 and rollups, for example, when they build, they look to save the proof data on the Bitcoin. But then the problem is, unlike Ethereum mainnet, how do you prove or verify the proof that they are saving is correct, for example? So that then goes into the same question. You're taking the Bitcoin data and then you're processing it off chain, and then you're saving it back to Bitcoin. And how do you ensure the computation is done correctly? And how do you ensure the data you saved is not tampered? So the Bitcoin Oracle can help there. So there are a number of discussions that we're having to apply the same concept across multiple meta protocols and L2s. That's number one. The second one, in terms of the scalability, now the problem is if you were to expand beyond the BRC20, and BRC20 currently I think takes about 50% of the Bitcoin network activity. At least that's what I saw in December. So it's actually, in terms of number of transactions you need to process, you're talking about a lot of data. And then because Bitcoin Oracle handles multiple indexes, the order of magnitude you're talking about is actually far greater than simply processing the Bitcoin data itself. And then putting all of them onto the on-chain is also challenging. So what we're introducing, I think we'll be announcing shortly, probably in the next week or two, is what they call on-demand data model for the Bitcoin Oracle. So all the signed data will be available on our Bitcoin, what you call Bitcoin nodes, which we look to decentralize and run by our community. And it's the model itself is in the Oracle. I suppose the Oracle's Chainlink and PIT, and the difference between the two. So the Chainlink is what you call a push model, and then PIT is the pull model. And there are many benefits, but the way Bitcoin Oracle is heading towards is that of PIT, in that the users, the end consumer of the Bitcoin Oracle data, will consume the data only as they need it. That way, the whole infrastructure can scale far better, and it's far easier to decentralize the operation of it among our community.
That's interesting because I feel like with this model, with this like modular approach, you're able to stay nimble and see what the community needs. So if we need scalability in terms of development, then we're able to create these different meta protocols rather quickly and kind of submit that into like this ecosystem where we leverage oracles, we leverage the ability to make sure that the off-chain computation is actually accurate.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious,
correct, yeah.
Just from like a third-party observer's perspective, I guess, putting on the shoes of a general user for these decentralized applications of the future. Will all this like new added infrastructure that you guys are kind of piecing together, will this add like a new, the fact that now that we need to achieve consensus among indexers and stuff, is this going to add some new vertical of, I guess, user friction, meaning like a delay in the indexer processing? So where like the data, I imagine there's much more like the user experience benefits of like, I guess, relying on a centralized indexer is quicker processing, right? Regardless of whether or not it's accurate or not. But if we're creating like a stratification and then a consensus mechanism around this, there has to be some sort of
trade-off.
Yeah. Or am I mistaken? Like, how's this going to manifest from the user experience perspective?
You're absolutely correct. But I think that's it's kind of funny. It's going to add certain frictions, and obviously we are adding more. Just like I mentioned earlier, stacks as an L2 settling into the Bitcoin, it cannot be sort of more secure than the Bitcoin itself, and anything that builds on Bitcoin has the same, and then there are additional processes that you need to do. Same applies to Bitcoin Oracle, for example, because Bitcoin Oracle relies on the off-chain indexers. It cannot process the data as fast as off-chain indexers, for example, right? So it's going to add somewhat the friction. Now, the reason why I said it's kind of funny or somewhat sort of a blessing is we are building on Bitcoin, whose confirmation time is 5 to 10 seconds anyway. And the vast majority, if not all of the computation and the additional layer that we are building, that we are talking about, is going to add, now with the stacks, with the Nakamoto release, a few seconds to that 5 to 10 minutes, So it's not something people will notice.
Gotcha.
So that's where I talk about the trade-off. It is the trade-off users will, we think, willingly make, because they don't lose on the convenience they have versus the additional security you can gain. Now, if you want faster one, you should have gone to Solana.
Yeah.
Right. You shouldn't be on
centralized.
Bitcoin. There's a reason why you're here.
That's right.
Although interesting there, though, we have seen actually a lot of, I keep talking about our targeting Bitcoin holders and so on. But when we look at our platform activities, you'll be surprised how many EVM users actually came to Stacks and Bitcoin to participate in the launches and the minting and so on.
Sure.
So our EVM bridge to the Ethereum mainnet and the BNB chain have gotten so much busier after this.
Sure.
So I think people do travel from the faster world to slow world if there are value to be captured. And that's what you tell the project builders as well. Actually, a number of people ask, because we lack the support system and so on, isn't it riskier to build on Bitcoin? But then what I tell people is, from the project builder's perspective, actually, no. I think it is actually a lower risk because there are a lot more lower hanging fruits based on the playbook you learned from the EVM space that you can apply. So I think it's a sort of interesting, but I don't think many people actually realize at the moment.
Yeah, they definitely do not.
It's another call to developers right there.
Yeah, absolutely. So Chan, I have another question. So we were talking about a meta protocol. So Ayman mentioned one that we created called non-arbitrary tokens from digital matter theory. And so Benny is the one indexing this for us because we're using the TAP protocol, right? So he's taking care of that. But we are also creating other projects associated with the metaverse and all that with Bitmap and everything. And we can't have Benny index, this other stuff, right? So do you recommend, like, how long is it going to take for this like consensus mechanism to actually be deployed? And do you recommend that we do our own indexing for our own stuff? Is that like the recommendation that you would have?
I think, okay. The first question in terms of the integration time. So we are currently integrating another meta protocol as we speak, and the requirements they need to meet. Essentially, we need to have endpoints provided by the indexers that tell us the transfer information and the user balance.
Yes.
And once those information are available, then you can quickly integrate into the Bitcoin Oracle and then produce essentially, this very similar, if not the same output as any other meta protocol, because we don't really care about the deploy and mint, because that doesn't affect necessarily the user balance. What affects is really the transfer, and that affects the change in the balance. So long as endpoints are supporting that and you can fetch, the integration time, we're talking about a matter of days. So actually very quick. Having said that though, Bitcoin Oracle is going to be useless if there's only one indexer, provides the data. So we do require at least the two indexers, independent, hopefully ideally independent implementation. Now, so that's the requirement. Now, if you have your own meta protocol, running your own indexer to a certain extent is almost a must, because you know the best, right?
Right.
Or at least you need to work with someone who can, do it. So I think that will, okay, let me take that back. Actually, it's not necessarily a must, but it will just help from the user adoption perspective, so much better than an alternative.
Sure.
Right. And then what we talk to, even within the sort of within the meta protocols as well. For example, on the BRC20 space, we are working closely with Best in Slot, who recently launched the OPI. I think that stands for Open Indexer or something like that.
Yeah.
They have a community who wants to run the instances of those indexers who conform to the BRC20 standard. And then what we are working with them is they encourage their community members to run multiple indexes themselves. And then they can then plug into the Bitcoin Oracle, thereby enhancing overall security of number one BRC20, and also rewarding the OPI community who runs those instances. So there are many sort of collaborations that we do and can do with indexers, one form or another. But but that's sort of the process generally we take.
Yeah, that's an interesting answer, and something what I guess I anticipated with what we're building, and it's basically the only way to do it, because you got to be able to show traction. And once you're able to do that, then you can kind of encourage other indexers to say, want to participate in like indexing, and then you can be part of like this whole Oracle ecosystem, so that you have basically two different endpoints supplying information, and then you come to a consensus using this mechanism.
But typically, there's no real incentive for other indexers to support like any given meta protocol unless they have some sort of like platform built above
some sort of
right?
service.
Correct. Yeah, like an Ordinals wallet. They seem to want to support every single new meta protocol that kind of emerges as any kind of traction at all.
Yeah.
But the reason why they have that monetary incentive, right?
That's right.
By me supporting this new information base, now the assets have true value on our marketplace, right? So, in the absence of that, you described, I guess, like an indexer network that is incentivized, I guess, for running nodes within this network. What is the actual direct incentive? Is this I think we heard about this, right? This is like the SATS BRC20 token is going to be utilized as somehow as the incentive mechanism, or is this something completely different?
I think Unisat wants to use SATS BRC20 as an incentive. I think incentive, we're talking about centralization, and if you want to move away from the centralization, then we're talking about essentially decentralization. That means participation by others, your community, right? But the thing is, you cannot ask people to spend their money and help you just out of their goodwill. I don't think that's a sustainable one. If you want to run it properly, sustainably, you need to have a proper incentive system in place. Number one, to encourage people to participate. And number two, it's not just about the participation, but also they need to participate and be performant, right, on an ongoing basis. So from that perspective, I think incentive system has to be in place for any meta protocols and indexes if they want to grow. So, a few now for the Bitcoin Oracle, we are, some of the discussions that we have, for example, is a lot of indexes now want to expand across multiple meta protocols. So they tend to then aggregate across meta protocols. So that's at the off-chain indexes. And then in return, what Bitcoin Oracle does is we aggregate across multiple off-chain indexes, and thereby in return then across multiple meta protocols as well. So there are multiple layers of incentives that can exist. For example, off-chain indexes are targeting their own community. I mentioned about the Uniset and Best in Slot and so on, having incentive mechanism to encourage people to join, but also have them slashed if they don't perform well. And then there can be, is there done any definitive plan here, an incentive, the program that the Bitcoin Oracle will implement to encourage off-chain indexes to join and also be performant as well. So across all all instances, I think the incentive is going to be the key, and that's what motivates essentially all the economic activities, right?
All right, Chan, I could speak with you for hours about this stuff. I've learned a lot talking to you about, the indexing and everything about Alex Labs and Stacks. I would love to have you back on, and just to talk a little bit more once the 2024 gets in the heat of it, because I know this is probably going to be the craziest year for Bitcoin for all kinds of reasons: ordinals, stacks, ETFs, things like that. So I really appreciate your time, Chan. Any last words that you'd like to say before we go?
I mean, I think there's so much. I'm very grateful for the ordinals and the BRC emergence of those. Not only from the technology it introduced, but then also, but more importantly, I think it really changed the mentality that people had, that you can build on Bitcoin. And to be honest, I don't think that mentality existed until last year. And I think that is very important, that we can do some stuff on Bitcoin. And, as a result, it is making all of us very exhausted because there's so much innovation going on. And I think that momentum will continue. A lot of people compare what is going on right now on Bitcoin to, depending on sort of where you started, 2017 or 2019, or by EVM before the DeFi summer and so on. And I can relate to that. There's a sort of, if you join, ordinals event, for example, and so on, smaller circle, if you know the stuff, then if you don't, you don't. But things are happening. And I think things will be happening more and more. And as you mentioned, I think 2024 is going to be very, very interesting year for Bitcoin. And it's something that we are very much looking forward to. What's in it, for us and everyone.
Yeah, I want to congratulate you guys for being early on Bitcoin and building on, seeing something before everyone else saw. And you guys, had the conviction to go and build on top of something that a lot of people decided not to build on. So I want to commend you guys. I really appreciate all the work that you guys have been doing, and I want to appreciate again your time for joining us today, Chan. It's been an honor just kind of talking to you about all this, because we're really excited about what's happening with the space. So we're happy to have you come back on, and thank you very much, man.
No, definitely. I mean, I like your show, and I would love to come back again. So, but thank you very much for having me.
Awesome. And for everyone else, all the links will be in the description. I appreciate you guys for watching, and we will catch you in the next podcast.
Peace.